Hello, everyone. I think it's time to start this very timely news conference, and I will not take your time by giving a lengthy introduction, except to say that Rex and Keiko Ziak are involved in the return of objects of memory to bereaved families, and that this is a wonderful act of reconciliation and atonement, and I think it's very timely at this juncture when we are seeing historical revisionism rearing its head again. So I'd like to hand over the microphone to Rex Ziak. I shall also at the same time introduce you to Dr. Chopra, who has been a resource person for them in their work in the returning of these wartime memorabilia to the families of the deceased. Thank you.
Okay. I'll see if this is right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And it's a pleasure to be here at the FCCJ, the new building. I was able to see the old office a couple of years ago. So I'd like to thank the FCCJ for allowing us here today, and in particular to thank the PAC committee for approving of our presence here, and Ms. Sayakawa-san, who made many arrangements for us. So thank all of you. And thank you all journalists who took your time out to come and listen to our story. This coming Sunday, November 24th, one of the most extraordinary events in the history of mankind is going to occur. And what that is that a family who has a war souvenir, an object that was taken at a time of war, proudly brought back, is now going to be returned to the relatives of a deceased soldier who never came home. And this is really something exceptional, and it is what OBON Society does, is that we have set ourselves up as a point of contact, almost like you might imagine like an emergency room in a hospital. We don't invite people to do this, or we don't tell people to do this, but we are there as a service. And from all around the world, people find us who have items that were taken from deceased Japanese soldiers. And in their hearts, they feel this item should go back to the brother or sister of this person, or to the son or daughter of that person. And so we operate as just a merely providing the service of the point of contact. We receive the items, we do a nationwide search, and then return these items. And this coming Sunday, what is so special is that Dr. Chopra here, who is a resident of Kenya, had in his possession numerous items that came from World War II that were taken from deceased soldiers. And he contacted us several months ago and told us, and as I'll have him explain later on, that for 30 years he has been trying to have these items returned back to Japanese soil, to the family they belong to. And he had been unsuccessful in 2 previous attempts to return these. And finally, upon contacting OBON Society, we were very fortunate to be able to make a connection and get this back to the family. The item that will be returned in this case, because there's many different sorts of personal items we receive, is a small little photo album measuring, maybe in inches, maybe 6 inches by 4 inches. And this photo album, of all things, belonged to the person here you see sitting on this horse. His name was Hideo. Hideo, Keiko? Shikata. And we received this photo album, we did a search, and after a period of time, Keiko is talking to his 89-year-old brother. And all that he knows is his brother went off to war. somewhere to the south, right? Somewhere to the south. And then it was just nothing for all these years. And finally, back is coming something that his brother carried, that has his brother's handwriting in it, and images that were special to his brother, a little photo album that he kept with him on the Philippine Islands. And this, for OBON Society, is a very special event, but it's also something that goes on every week of the year. So far this year, we have returned 83 items to families here in Japan. That now comes up to over 300 items in total that we've returned back to native soil in the past years that we've been working. And so this will be just one of many that is going back. But each one to the family is a miracle. It is something very special to them. And each one to the families that have that experience, it is an unforgettable moment of closure. And I think the one thing that all of us humans can say is a trait that's common among all of us, and that is, if a relative of ours disappears, just simply vanishes, whether it's in a sailing boat that sinks or in a plane that crashes or whatever, where a relative leaves home and no trace of them is ever found, that creates a hole in that family that is never filled. There's always this wonderment, and what happened to him, and where is he, and where, what? And then that day where something comes back, anything that is personal to that person, it fills that hole in that family. It brings closure. There's just some rest that occurs. And that miracle is what OBON Society does. I could go on and talk some more, but actually several years ago, an American TV station came and did a little special on us where they actually interviewed some people who had asked us to help them, much like Dr. Chopra had. And so we're going to take 4 minutes here now and just watch a little edited version of this piece.
One second. You know, I must apologize. I completely misunderstood the order of the discussion. I think it would be really helpful at this time if Dr. Chopra could speak about, because I thought he was your advisor, but in fact he's a case study, as he said.
He's a client, yes.
He's a client. So I think that perhaps it would really be a good idea for him to do that, and then you can do the background. Okay,
whatever you say.
So
okay.
I think it would be a really good idea for Dr. Chopra to talk, because this is really what it's all about, right? Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, as Rex had said, to the club for inviting us, and for all of you to take the time to come here today. I'll try and be very brief, as indeed has been introduced. I'm just a humble case study in this much longer process, but perhaps I can just tell you a little bit about my story to fill in the blanks and to give you at least a connection to the photographs that are on the wall. And I just want to make a few very brief points. Let me just say something about myself. Normally, in these circumstances in my professional life, I've had a long career in peacekeeping operations, so I'm usually talking about the specifics of reconciliation and peacekeeping and all of those kinds of things from a professional angle, from an operational perspective. And I've spent years in Somalia, so I'm coming here actually from Somalia. And that's one set of issues. And it's interesting now, rather not something I normally do, to talk about more my personal side of the story, which does connect to those professional things, because of course it has this reconciliation or settling kind of a story running through it. The road that I took to OBON Society, as Rex had mentioned, has spanned really 30 years. I think I've had this album probably for 40 years or more, amongst other things. But it was probably in the early 90s or the beginning of the 90s that there was that impulse, and I'll come back to what that impulse was, but that impulse to want these things to be in their proper place, or in the place where they belong. And the problem was that there was no one to turn to. There was no address. It was not clear who would facilitate that. And my first thought in those days, and it was controversial obviously, was to turn to Yasukuni Jinja, because obviously that's the shrine of the war dead, and that's the obvious place to start asking questions. And that wasn't a very effective experience. Some more years passed, and then it was 1999, 2000. And eventually I contacted the Japanese consulate in Boston and said, look, I have these various things. Went up there and met with the consul general and the staff there. And they were sympathetic, but they didn't really know what to do. They involved the foreign ministry, the health ministry, so multiple ministries is a very awkward way of dealing with what's a very human impulse. And on top of that, it wasn't clear that they would or could be involved in the tracing process. Even if someone would receive something, would they undertake the research effort to find a family? And then I think it was 2007, I tried again through the Japanese consulate in Boston, and that sort of fell apart. And then another dozen years passed, and I really wanted to draw a line under this, and it was in July, I guess, that I discovered online that something called OBON Society had got created. So at least it was an address. And I phoned them up and I said, I was by this time very cynical and not expecting anyone to help in any way. And I said, look, this has been my experience, and it's really been unsatisfactory, and I've been trying to do this for a long time. But do you have an answer? And yes, there's probably a bit of mutual trust building that occurred. But at the end of the day, I sent them everything that I had. And they immediately began the process of tracing. And in this one case, fairly quickly, probably because of information that was in the specific album, they were able to find the family and then invited me to come here. So it's been a long road, but there's a bit of light at the end of the tunnel to actually do something and see something returned. Just to give you a bit more of a background to how I got to that point, so I had a great uncle who had fallen at Singapore, but he was also someone who was missing in action. And it's taken generations and my lifetime and the internet and things like that to be able to try and understand, and it's not entirely clear yet, but to try and understand what happened to him. And probably he was torpedoed in a Dutch ship leaving Penang for Colombo. There was a brain trust of officers who were entrusted with getting the lessons of the Malaya campaign and the fall of Singapore to evacuate. This was the day before the fall of Singapore. And it was a ship called the SS Rusboom. Almost certainly he was probably on that vessel, and then that was torpedoed by I-59. The Japanese submarine. But all that was ever told to the family was that he was missing in action. But these things didn't come from him. It was by virtue of the fact that if you have someone in the war, these war relics were circulating, they were moving around. I had an interest. I ended up being a repository for these things, but also always felt there was a need to return these things. Partly, and this is a much longer story that I don't have time for today, but this goes back to family history, going back to 1849, where my own family was defeated with the British conquest of India. And then that produced personal objects of my ancestors that went missing in history, and in fact only last year have possibly found one of them. So already there was a background, and I'm sort of sitting on two sides of this. I have this experience of a defeat and a surrender in 1849, while on the other hand, I have these objects coming from the Second World War. So I'm sort of seeing both sides of this. And the last thing I'll say, and then turn it back to Rex, is I think the important thing is to try and understand, or no, not really to understand, but just let me express that I think it's and in the discussions since I've been meeting Rex in the last couple of days, from my perspective, trying to understand the shape of the impulse. Why does someone want to give something back? This has been an exceptional thing from what I understand from Rex and Keiko and the OBON Society. This is becoming a phenomenon now. There's a lot of people who want to do this. It's an interesting question, why? And then, of course, on the other hand, what is the shape of the individuals or families who want to receive things? These are two very human things, and there'll be very different rationalizations, very different experiences. People will be coming from different perspectives. I think from my side, it's sort of this feeling of being very unsettled, having objects that kind of belong somewhere else, and you just want peace in your own life, and you're trying to reconcile the past and past experiences of the family. And what's interesting about this is that it's not limited to the participants, the primary participants in events. This is something that passes through generations. It's passed through generations, not just from the Second World War, but here I have this experience from 1849, which of course has had a thundering effect for the family for many generations. So I think these things will go on for a very long time unless you do something to settle them. Something like a return of an object. Maybe it won't do everything, maybe it will do everything, but it's something. And it's again a much longer discussion of this relationship of a physical object and the emotional or spiritual consequence of that, and what's the relationship between the two. But that's a much longer discussion.
Thank
so
you.
Less is more. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Rex, do you want to show the film now?
Well, I'll just preface the film a little bit, and just what Dr. Chopra said is something I'll just reiterate. In fact, you'll see it in the video here, and that is the Americans and the Western world are very materialistic. It's objects, it's things, and the Japanese are much more spiritual. And so the Americans send us these things, which we then search and return. But by the time it arrives here in Japan, it is no longer a thing. It is a living spirit. It is something that people talk to. People will take out to the cemetery and show their ancestors that the son has come home. They'll show the mother. It is something that transforms itself in this process. And you'll see that in this little CBS film. So if my wife can start up the computer here and get this playing, of course, technology, you know how it is. And then maybe we can dim some lights and we'll listen here.
Glenn Stockdale of Billings, Montana, did come home. He fought the Japanese in the Pacific until 1945. As a young staff sergeant, he saw things most of us can't even imagine. And until the day he died, at age 84, kept most of it to himself.
Never talked about the war.
It just sort of, he just locked it all away.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's Glenn's son, Terry. What he knew of his dad's service came mostly from rummaging through his father's old footlocker.
It was in the basement, so as kids you go down and look at it and see what's in here, what's in there.
Among other things, Terry found a Japanese flag, carefully folded, stained with blood, and covered in writing. Collecting them was commonplace. Pictures abound of U.S. servicemen posing with the flags. Known as a Yosagaki Hinamaru, Japanese soldiers carried them as keepsakes into battle, good luck charms of sorts, with wishes from family and friends scrawled around the rising sun. And nearing the end of his father's life, Terry suggested it was time the flags go home. What did you say to him?
I thought it'd be nice to send it back to Japan.
And
he said no.
Because?
Must be the hate from fighting people and just war. I don't know what that does to individuals. I've never been there.
So that's where things, and the flags, sat for more than a decade, until Terry heard another World War II vet speak of the flags. His name was Leland Bud Lewis, something that at age 95, Bud still doesn't take lightly. Why now? Why is it important, you think, to return the flags now?
Well, it's a closure. You can't keep hating people.
Inspired, Terry Stockdale packed up one of his father's flags and mailed it to the only place he thought could help. Keiko and her husband Rex Ziak run a non-profit called the OBON Society. Terry Stockdale waited and hoped, and then came word that the OBON Society had traced his flag back to a man named Yosugushu Kishi, a young soldier who kissed his wife, his 7-month-old son, and his 2-year-old daughter goodbye, and never saw them again.
When I got the call, I thought this was impossible. My mind just went blank. After 70 years, I never dreamed something of my father's would surface.
They found out Terry not only had their father's flag, but he wanted to come to Japan to deliver it himself. Anxious, they met Terry at the train station. What happened next says it all.
I mean, yeah, it's just beyond comprehension what it meant to them. It's just kind of, you know, it just wasn't some souvenir. It was actually their father coming home.
Terry officially handed it over at a formal ceremony, and then stepped back to watch two people who never knew their father unfurl his flag together.
We don't know the warmth of his hands, the sound of his voice. I can't remember a thing about my father. And I said, "I'm sorry, Dad," to that flag. "I'm so sorry."
You know, the old saying, it's better to give than receive. It just feels so good to do something for somebody.
As for his own father, well, Terry hopes that Staff Sergeant Glenn Stockdale is also finally at peace.
He'd be proud of me. He would know it's the right thing to do.
Well, thank you very much for that very touching segment. Okay, so would you like to say a few words, or shall we open for questions? I think maybe...
Well, I'll take a few moments here just to explain. What you just saw, as I said, has happened 83 times so far this year, and over 300 times in total for OBON Society. And it's just one at a time. And what will occur here on Sunday in Kyoto with Dr. Chopra is he will return to the 89-year-old brother and maybe 84-year-old brother and an 82-year-old brother and a sister of this gentleman here on the horse, Hideo. It was his photo album. And that return back to that family, those three brothers and sister, will be the only memento that they have of their brother after all these years. But in addition to this, when you see these flags that you just saw here that was returned, of course that goes back to the Kishi family. However, all those other signatures on that generally are neighbors, people across the street, other farmers, business people all around them. And what our experience is when one of those items returns to the family, for years afterwards, relatives come and will knock on the Kishi door and they want to see their grandfather's signature or their great uncle's signature. Rumor gets out that so-and-so's name is on there, and they come home from New Year's time and they hear that and they come and they want to see. And so the flag is unfurled again and again and again and again. It is just it becomes this community event of everybody, all the relatives surrounding the one family that receives it. In this photo album's case, what is so exceptional is the people of this community, and it's just a farming community, gathered, as you can see there in this group picture. And maybe all of the elder men, or a majority of them, dressed in their kimonos, and they got an elevated camera somehow up, and they stood there at attention and had this portrait taken of them. And then this was printed up and sent to the son, Hideo. And there it was. Nobody in the village knows that that photo arrives. And we sent a little, just a rough little 8 by 10 little printout of it to the brother of Hideo that Mr. Chopra will be meeting on Sunday. And he looks and he goes, "There's my father." And then he showed it to another man and he says, "There's," what was it, Keiko? Both grandparents, and then his mother and a sister or something. So this is coming back, and this is going to be in the community itself. It's this heirloom of everybody who was alive at that time, and nobody has ever seen that before. So we had this large print made just because we know there's going to be such interest in this resonating throughout the community as people want to come and see this. So the photo album itself is not damaged. So that's this particular case. So we can open this up for questions now.
Sure. Thank you. Can you just identify yourself by name and affiliation, working press people first, please? Thank you.
Steve Robson from Stars and Stripes.
Yeah, can you come up to the mic? Is that okay?
Stars and Stripes.
This is a question for Dr. Chopra. I was just wondering, how did you end up with all of these items? How did they all come to you, especially the album?
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was trying to explain before. In my case, as I mentioned, my great uncle had fallen in Singapore, so it didn't come from him. Although he was sort of a collector of things, not really of war relics or war trophies, but the people that he knew and the family and friends who, of course, did have a lot of these things. And fairly early on, I had an interest in obviously trying to find out what had happened to my great uncle, and a lot of people were just not interested in these things that were hanging around various people's families, and they knew I had this particular interest. And so I ended up being this repository. People sort of giving them to me, and I obviously. I had this intention of returning them, but that was a very long journey. So it wasn't specifically for my great uncle, but it was friends and families who had collected this stuff and then just didn't want it anymore, and they knew I had this very specific interest, and so that's how it ended up in my hands. But I just, had no idea what to do with it in terms of returning it for a very, very long time. Obviously respected it. In this case, it's a photograph album. It's someone's private life, and you have some respect for that. And who knows? Maybe cosmically, that's why it came to me, because I was at least having some respect for it. But really played the role of a caretaker for many decades, it just was very difficult to know how to return these things. So I ended up basically taking care of them for many decades.
Sorry, I'll just ask the follow-up. Can you give us like a rough list of some of the things you've got? I mean, you've got swords,
Sure.
flags, those sort of things, and also just talking about the photo in particular. Did that come from a particular service member or something? Can you give us a little bit more detail on how that traced it from this fella to you?
So he was well, first to answer the first part of your question, I mean, that collection of stuff involved flags, it involved the belts of 1,000 stitches, it involved documents of medals, it involved a sword. There's a sword that I've sent to the OBON Society, which has a family mon on it. To the extent that a family crest is usable to trace someone, I don't know if that's helpful, and we've tried to talk about what to do about things like that. Then there was stuff which was not really traceable, and I realized that. I've sent it to them anyway, helmets and hats, and where that ends up is for OBON Society to decide, but I simply wanted to unburden myself, with that. If I understand the story, and I've now really have only understood from the OBON Society's tracing where this album ended up. So if I understand the story correctly, he was killed in Leyte in April 1945. This particular soldier, wow. Hideo, and you can go into what was the situation on the ground. That was probably around the time that forces were advancing to Manila, but the Battle of Leyte Gulf was well over. So, you know, what are the circumstances in which he was killed? What happened to that album at that point? I don't know. And then that would have been American forces for the most part, and obviously my family was in the British Army. So, how that came from an American source, probably to sort of my broader contacts, I don't know the transmission of that and how that went from one to another, other than to say more generally and more broadly, you know, for many decades after the war, this stuff was circulating, people were giving it to each other. In some cases that the OBON Society has dealt with, you do have those cases where people themselves brought it home, kept it in a trunk, you know, until in their 80s and 90s. But there's another side where a lot of this stuff was just moving around and circulating, and the direct connection to where it came from, other than surmising that, okay, in Leyte in April 1945, what was the circumstance? I don't know what records here show about the circumstances of his death, because that might indicate, well, then who actually picked this up off the battlefield? Was it picked up by intelligence, for instance, or who knows? I don't know that story. It's another layer of research and tracing that could be done either by the family or, you know, well, I don't overburden the OBON Society.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, please, can you come up?
Thank you. Mary Corbett, freelance. I have one question and something I wanted to bring to your attention. So in the battlefield, if you find objects obviously belonging to the dead soldier, is there any legal question of ownership? Because, of course, some of it will be rather more commercially sellable than others, I suppose. And I don't know if products are like that are being sold on the market. And the other one is, I felt great serendipity when I saw your notice, because only the day before I had received a email from an old family, 100 years in Japan, but now the sons are living in the US, and their friend wanted to see if there was some way of returning a sword, I believe, that his father had brought back from the battlefronts. And then the next day we get this notice. So, yeah, it all happens, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, with regards to the swords, we can give you our contact information and put them in touch with us and see what we can do about that. They're very difficult, of course. All of this is difficult. It's just different degrees of difficulty finding the families. And I got hung up on the sword. Her first question was
about the legal ownership. Legality.
I'm sure Dr. Chopra will be able to quote it in perfect Latin, but what is it? To the victor go the spoils of war. The tradition was the winner takes all. The person takes it. I have heard that in the Geneva Convention or whatever, there were strict rules about treatment of deceased soldiers and all of this, but it was war. And bringing home a souvenir. I think, if I had to guess, since the earliest of times when people would go to war 500,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago or whenever, they would bring back the clubs or sticks or the rocks that the other people were using so they could use the weapons. And it probably began there, of taking things from the battlefield, bringing back their arrows and their knives. And but in World War II, it was widespread, and you had a very interesting situation where, in the Euro-American mindset, capturing a flag is very significant. Not only because it is the symbol of the leadership of the other side generally, but back when people used to charge each other with swords and shields, the flags was usually indicated where your commanding officer was, and it was a signal. And if you saw your flag going the other way, that meant it was a retreat and follow the flag. Or if the flag's in front of you, you know there's the front line. And so the flag was very symbolic, and if you could ever capture the enemy's flag, it would disorient the enemy because they didn't know where their commander was. And so here in World War II, you have one situation where you have Allied soldiers who are hardwired looking to capture that officer's flag and bring it home, the greatest of all souvenirs. And on the other side of the ocean, you have a group of people who create a tradition or a little custom where they take their national flag, which is mostly white, and their love of calligraphy to write on that white field their names, their signatures just comes together. And everybody going to war carried 1 or 2 or 3 of these items with them. And so it was like the greatest gift to the Allied soldiers that there should be virtually hundreds of thousands of these flags available on the battlefield. The American government, what I know, had set up a system where if you captured items of any military importance, you would take it to the commanding officer and you'd be issued a document after they inspected it to make sure that there was no intelligence associated with it. It would be returned to you and you could ship that home. And we've received many of those papers with items we've been sent showing that the government, Sergeant so-and-so on this date had given approval to their father to bring this back. So it was accepted and approved of by the American government to return these items.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Well, just a second. Any further questions? I'd like to use the chair's prerogative. I couldn't, I'm a little bit surprised, Dr. Chopra, you are now in Somalia. What are you doing in Somalia?
Nothing to do with the return of war relics and war trophies.
No, but it's a good idea to want to locate you. So why are you there?
No, I've had a long career with the UN and the World Bank, and was in Somalia in the early 90s with the UN. Came back to Somalia in 2007, and then since then I used to manage Somalia and Eritrea for the World Bank. Then I was head of the sanctions regime in Somalia, and then managing accountability programs. So I've had a whole series of jobs in Somalia, including to the, well, for quite some time. So
you live there now?
I live in Nairobi.
I see, okay, good.
But I've certainly spent my fair share of my time living in Mogadishu.
No, it's just that the point is that I think when people are writing stories, they want to know your address, that's all. So, okay, so that you are now living in Nairobi. Okay, thank you so much, thank you. Any further questions? Okay, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I'll just add one more thing just to give a little bit of background, because what you saw there in this video and what you've heard is sort of the tip of the iceberg, just in case you're interested. But OBON Society is now in our 10th year of operation, and we have actually created accidentally, we created an organization where it is very systematic how this all comes about. When people contact us, they are responded to, they're kind of queried about the details associated with this. What do they want with it as far as its return, or where do they live? It is sent to us, it's released to us, and then we have a group of archivists that examine it professionally. They photograph the details and create high-resolution images of specific details that they determine would be essential for the search. Then that information is put into a database, and that goes to a group of scholars who study this and examine it. And one of the biggest problems, of course, is the cursive handwriting that is used is not something that the average person can read today. It is a different kanji character. It's many, many different people writing their names. It's sometimes done with a lot of flourish. It's been on a piece of cloth that's maybe been through the mud. It's been through war. There's holes in it. And so for the scholars to stitch that back and reassemble all of those names is work in itself, something that a lot of people can't even begin to do. Then when that information is determined comes the process of trying to figure out, where did this person live? And there is unfortunately no street address or home address on these items. It's just an item filled with names. And so the scholars work to analyze this and how they make their guesses and how they make their determinations. And sometimes they say, well, we all, in conclusion, talking about it, we think this came from Sendai, or this came from Chiba, or we're quite sure this came from here. And then at that point, it is actually, the information is passed on to another group of associates that are scattered throughout all of Japan. Is it okay to mention that, Keiko?
I think so.
And so we are working now with the Begree Family Association, the Izakukai. And they have offices in each prefecture and then many satellite offices. And so now in our cooperative agreement with them, they receive this information, such as the people in Chiba, and they look at it. And in some cases, they may know some of those family names. And they may say, those people those families are on the other side of the lake. They live over there. And so then they can go and do the door-to-door search to actually find where the people live. And so when that is done, the information comes back to us that we've confirmed and made contact with the actual family, who they are, where they live. And then we reply back to the family who sent it to us. And we tell them this information, as we did Dr. Chopra, that we found the family. It's an 89-year-old brother. He lives here, and this is where it's going to go. Several years ago, what would happen at that point is, of all things, the Americans or the British or the Australians, whoever it is that we're dealing with on this case, would ask us, can I go and personally deliver it? Can I go meet them? And we suddenly realized, not suddenly, but over time we realized that we had tapped into a very deep and intimate area of reconciliation, of making things right, not just for the Japanese family, but as you saw this Terry Stockdale, for the American family. And well, the complexity of that and the difficulty is just unsurmountable with all these people. So what we concluded is, what we'd say is, well, what you can do if you're interested is you can write them a letter. And if you do, we will translate that into Japanese and it will accompany the item.
Okay.
And so,
can I ask you a couple of questions? Is that okay?
Sure.
I think that you've definitely, told us that this is a very noble pursuit, and I think it's wonderful. Can you tell us who supports you? And I'm sure that there are many people who would find your work worthy of support in some way. Have you been able to find in the United States or in Japan people who think that you should carry this on and who would like to help you in some way? Or is there a government agency or somebody who would like to help you with this? Because obviously this must be an enterprise that takes a considerable amount of effort and time on your behalf, on your side, does it not?
Well, you would think. Keiko and I started this just by ourselves, with our own time and our own money and savings, and it took years to even begin to understand what was going on and how to do this. The first problem being how to convince somebody to send us something, how to trust us that we weren't going to sell it or throw it away. And then the second problem would be, how do you take this one thing that was picked up on a battlefield 70-some years ago, Saipan or Okinawa or whoever, and how do you trace that back to one house somewhere here in Japan? I mean, nothing written on it. How do you do that? So we spent our time and our money trying to figure this system out. And probably for the first 5 or 6 years, it was just under our own effort. And then some people, seeing what we were doing, would start to send us items, and they would include a little check of $50 or $75 that we could apply towards the shipping or to the email or whatnot. Now that has grown. We have a little microbrewery in Portland, Oregon that does an annual charity raise for us. There's actually a World War II veteran who passed away in Seattle, Washington, and he left a private foundation, and a little bit of that money comes to us. There's a Japanese American Friendship Association in New York that sees what we're doing, the importance of this, of just making things right in this post-war world that we still live in, and they fund us a little bit. And now, just recently, we have received word that the Izukukai, the Bereaved Family Association, is going to help cover some of our expenses for our shipping and whatever. Our people, our vast network of people, all work as volunteers. Keiko and I have never taken a penny of compensation in the last 10 years for our time, because there just isn't money, and that would get in the way of success. And so, but there's starting to become more of an interest in maybe somebody funding us. But what we are dealing with, of course, is one of the most difficult and complex relationships any two nations can have. When two nations go to war and the citizens of one nation kill the citizens of another nation and they fight, that creates scars and hardship and feelings and stress that takes a long, long time for people to heal from. And we're still in that healing process. And so it isn't just wide open where everybody wants to support us.
Okay.
So
well,
can I just add?
sure. Go ahead,
we are the 501c3 Oregon-based non-profit organization, so that we work as a non-profit organization. It is always difficult, and then we are fundraising in order to do a proper effort in order to make this happen. Rex and I, along with other associate and volunteer who believe in this mission, we figured out what is the most efficiency, and we do care both sides of the families. That's what we believe in, and then we do that. But in order to expand our effort, there's so many countless flags around the world. So our effort is really torn apart. One, we need to raise in the money, fundraising, and all this issue we still have to take in care. And then one side we are very good at and taking care of the family returning process. So if anybody who have access to fundraising, and that's what really we need. So it's not luxury, somebody government supported an organization. We merely get started at, even though we said 10 years past. This is what we see. It's just a starting point of people recognize we have enough evidence to prove that this is not the bad things. People need more help. So in order to success, we need help.
Okay, I have to apologize for bursting out. I thought that you owned the brewery, so
No.
and that you were supporting it from the
Yes.
proceeds.
No.
That would probably give you quite a bit of working capital if you did that. Just a thought, in case. So, anyway, hi, Dozo. Please go ahead. Yes.
Hi, Masaru Rano from GG Press. I have two questions. One, I understand that the item being given back on Sunday is a photo album. I understand that Hinomaru flags are more commonplace. Is it the first time for you to return a photo album, or is it common or not common? And the second question is, Hinomaru flags have signatures, so it's fairly easy to identify who signed what. But for photo albums, I understand it might be slightly more difficult to identify who is on that photo album. So how does that process work?
Yeah, the album is not the first case we return. In the previous years, we are able to return photo album and pictures and postcard and family letters. So any related to personal item, we are able to return, but our main focus is Yosegaki no Maru. But anything related to, again, the personal item, and if anything traceable, we try our best to find the family. And then for your second question about this particular album, actually there's about 20 pages of the photograph, and then one particular newspaper article was inside of the album. That was the biggest clue we are able to trace back.
So that paper was a local paper?
Yes, very, very remarkable regarding the Prime Minister Tojo commended this young soldier of the Shikata, and then that's praising about his parents. So that was a clue. Very remarkable article.
Now, seeing as he's on a horse, he's obviously an officer, right? He was an officer.
We don't know that. What Keiko was meaning about this newspaper clipping that's in this album is quite extraordinary, because what we've been able to piece together is he was on the Philippine Islands, and Prime Minister Tojo went there kind of on an inspection tour at some point. And apparently he saw this young man or met him. We don't know the circumstances, but he was so impressed with this young man that when Prime Minister Tojo came back to Tokyo, he wrote a letter to his father and mother, complimenting them as what outstanding and remarkable parents they must be to have raised such an outstanding young man. And so here's this little article, and Keiko starts reading this to the 89-year-old brother, and he goes, "I remember that. I remember the day the letter came from," and my father, who was just a carpenter, is just like stunned. What is the Prime Minister doing writing me? What do I do? And so he's asking everybody around town, what do I do? So he went to the mayor and said, what do I write the Prime Minister back with? And so he tells this rather hilarious story, as you can imagine, of just country folks receiving a letter, but still a compliment from the Prime Minister to the parents about the quality of son they brought into the world. So it's just really this.
Yes,
we're hoping to hear that story from him on Sunday.
Okay, I think we're sort of getting to the end of our conference. Any more questions? Working press, please.
I think he's raising the hand.
I'm sorry, I can't see very well. Ah, yes, good. Please. Okay.
Just a quick question. It's if you specifically, Dr. Chopra, is what motivated you personally to see that these are this photo album or other artifacts to be returned?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and that's where I left my remarks, is trying to understand the shape of the impulse of the person who wants to return something, and the shape of the receiver, and the shape of the emotional state of the receiver. People will have different motivations. People will use different words, maybe sometimes describing the same thing. So I'll use the words that I would use, and I would say that the real motivation was this feeling of unsettlement, if you like, that you have these objects. Here it's very personal. It's not impersonal like some other objects. Even the flags, though they may have signatures, here you're seeing someone's face, for instance. So it's a very personal thing. And I think in the whole issue of war trophies and war relics and returning things, there's a distinction to be made between what are personal items and what are public items. And when you're in the realm of personal items, you know that something has belonged to somebody else. And so you feel that it's out of place. And you want to give that back to the place where it belongs, which is, yes, partly for the family to be settled, but it's also for yourself to try and find some peace and some calm and some stillness, because you're carrying this thing which has been removed from violent and tragic circumstances. You're carrying this piece of tragedy with you, and at a certain point, all of that accumulates, and you want to say, you know what, it doesn't belong with me. It belongs somewhere else. It should be in its rightful place. And and that's probably what carried me through 30 years of saying, oh, this has to go back somehow. I don't know how. I don't know, there was no path being illuminated, but in fits and starts over time, finally there was an end. So the best way I can describe it, and it's an emotional thing, or it's a psychological thing, or you may use a spiritual thing, that somehow you feel it's in the wrong place and it should be in the right place, and you're looking for some order in the universe and some peace and calm all around.
Thank you very much. That was a very, how can I put it, uplifting way to end the conference. Thank you very much. And I think that we have another conference coming up, so we may not be able to remain in this room, but if you'd like to speak to either Dr. Chopra or to the Ziaks, I'm sure that they will be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Just introduce.
Well, I have to, one more thing. You asked me about the funding for this. The gentleman walking there, his name is Kudo, and he's been with us he's from
since
Hokkaido.
2013.
2013, and he's part of the success. He's one of a group of people who work tirelessly. He's a carpenter professionally, and in his spare moments, he is one of the scholars who tracks and connects dots to find these families, and they all work together in this teamwork. And so Kudo is part of the reason of our success and how we do this on just a shoestring. So thank you very much, Mr. Kudo.
The hero of the front line.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll be around here, so if anybody wants a little one-on-one conversation or whatever, if we can find a place to sit somewhere and talk, we'll be happy to answer more questions or details or whatever you may have. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you.